Unity buttons are pretty easy to break. Based on every single case ever reported, here are the 10 ways you need to know how to fix them. The first thing to check is Raycast target. Make sure it's checked on. The next one's pretty obvious. Is the button enabled? The next thing to check is that the target graphic is what you actually expect it to be. So here we've accidentally set the target graphic to be the text component, but it can sometimes end up being somewhere you really don't expect just because you've copied and pasted something. So if we go to it and we scroll down, we can see that it doesn't have its Raycast target set to be true. If we set it to be true, then we try to click it, it still doesn't do anything. So what's going on? It's actually that the vertex color is masking that the button wasn't responsive. It was actually being responsive the whole time, it's just that we couldn't see it. You also want to check that you don't have any very suspicious text boxes that are actually quite large and overlap the button. So this box is blocking the button, whereas this one, which is underneath the button, doesn't. Now, why does the OK text not block the button, even though both the suspicious text box and the OK text box have Raycast target to be true? It's because the canvas is organized hierarchically, so stuff near the top is below stuff near the bottom. So this image, if we dragged it over, would also block the button. But if we took that image and we put it underneath, then the button is still interactable, at least where the suspicious text box doesn't exist. If you have an image component or a text component and you want to leave them intentionally on top of the button, then you need to go and disable the Raycast target for both of them. And then your button will still be interactable. This is also a performance optimization because every single one of these Raycast targets is individually iterated every frame to check to see if there were selection events. And for text, you can actually set the default setting so that you never need to press Raycast target off ever again, because most of the time you don't actually want Raycast target on for text. Here's another property that can destroy a button, the Interactable property. And as I click that, you'll notice that it flipped into the disabled state, which is defined over here. But if this color were slightly less obvious, then it would be very difficult to tell that it's not in the interactable state. So it's recommended to keep the disabled color something so it's decently obvious, and also to make sure the button is interactable when it should be. The next few ways of fixing a broken button can save you hours of time if you ever get into one of these situations. So if we go to the canvas, do you see what's wrong? Something is missing. It's the graphic Raycaster. Double check your graphic Raycaster, make sure it doesn't have any funny settings here. These are the default settings. They should work in almost every situation. You only want to adjust these if you're doing something very special. And once the graphic Raycaster is on, the button works as expected. What the graphic Raycaster does is it checks all the recs in the scene. So if we go and we look at our button, it goes through everything that is a Raycast target, and it'll check its rect, the square points, to see whether it has been clicked. This next one is very easy to do, especially when you don't know what everything does. So the scene actually has changed just a little bit. Do you see the thing that's missing? It's actually the event system. Sometimes it's very easy to just delete this because you don't know what it does. You also don't want 2 or more event systems because that can also cause problems. If we take a look at the event system, you also want to make sure it doesn't have any obvious errors. This is just giving a warning that I am not using the correct input system, so it's recommending to replace it. Now the button will work, but you really should go ahead and replace it if you have this warning, if you've upgraded to the new input system. If you're using the old input system, you need to make sure that your horizontal and vertical axis and these other event labels are the same as what's in your input manager. If this is not spelled exactly the same way, then it's going to cause a problem. If you're using the new input system, which you can get to the input actions by searching in your project, you want to make sure that you haven't gone in and accidentally edited the UI or deleted it, because if you're missing the input map, then the UI won't work. This is what's here by default, so it should automatically work, but if you've gone in and edited it, maybe double check. The button can also break because you've broken its on-click event. So it might appear responsive, but it won't be clickable because either the game object has become missing or maybe you've renamed the function. So double check both of those things. The common cause with on-click events becoming broken is that the game object becomes missing through a cross-scene reference. So if you have one scene, say don't destroy and load, and then that object gets destroyed, or you have a button that references an object in another scene and then you unload that scene, then that click event is going to break. So you have to check at runtime and not just in the editor. The cursor API can also cause button problems, and it can get really tricky in the editor. So here's a common situation. Let's say you hide your cursor during play, but you want it to open during the pause screen, or maybe you hide your cursor for most actions, but then in the inventory you want the cursor to be available. You can't forget to unlock it. So why is the editor so dangerous? It's because if you press escape in the editor, it'll give you your cursor back when playing, so you might not even discover this bug until you're in a build. You might have a situation where you need to reorganize your hierarchy. Perhaps one thing needs to be moved down, or you have a parentage situation that needs to be corrected, or siblings need to be reordered relative to one another so that they work as expected. Objects might need to be moved so that you have the correct overlaps and you have the correct parent-child relationships for those overlaps. When dealing with deeply nested canvases, I'm quite surprised how many people don't know this shortcut. So if you click on an object and then you do Alt right arrow, it will unfurl, and then you can go down, examine the contents, and then refurl it by doing Alt left arrow, Alt right arrow, go back up and refurl it all, Alt left arrow. When you have multiple canvases, something that can come into play is the sorting order. So if we were to increase the sorting order of what would normally be the background canvas, it's now in the foreground. So if the order of your objects isn't exactly what you would expect, one place to check is the canvas sorting order. Canvas sorting order can actually be very useful if you want to, say, elevate a menu above all the other menus, some kind of modal window or a tooltip, that kind of thing. So there's a time and a place for using sorting order to solve otherwise tricky, hairy problems. Canvas groups are one of the most useful UI components, but they can also destroy a button. So here it has two properties that both will affect the button below it. So the canvas group is above the button. If we turn off Interactable, the button becomes non-interactable. And if we uncheck blocks raycasts, then the button becomes non-interactable. Blocks raycasts, the name kind of is the opposite of what you might expect. And then finally, if you have nested canvas groups, you also have this option to ignore parent groups, and that would be if you wanted to override one of these other settings. Canvas groups can actually be really helpful in this kind of situation. So let's say we have two menus, the first one, and then enable another menu, and we want only the foreground menu to be interactable. We don't want the background menu to be interactable. So what we can do is we can just, on our menu, use the canvas group to set it non-interactable, and it'll gray out, or we could disable blocks raycasts, and it'll do the same but without the graying out. Do you have a RectTransform on the button, and also on all the parents of the button? I had this button problem once, and it took me 3 hours. So did you notice we can click it over here, but we can't click it over here? If we look at the hierarchy, nothing appears to be in the way. It's a very simple hierarchy. So what could possibly be causing half the button to be broken and the other half not to be? Well, there's a property called Raycast padding, and what it does is it lets you extend or shrink the button. It can actually be a very useful property, but in this case, I've set it in 200, so it's going inward 200, which is making about half the button non-functional. If we were to set it to 0, then the button would return to its normal usage. And just to give a little demo of raycast padding, often you might want to extend a button a little bit or shrink a button a little bit, and raycast padding is exactly the property that you want to do that. Normally when using a mask, Unity behaves exactly as you would expect. So here we have a rect mask 2D container. When we disable that component, we can see the full size of the button, and when we enable it, Unity correctly trims the mask sections away. And the same thing goes for this mask container using a different component. But it has no source image specified, so it's using a square source image. And the same thing happens when we specify a shape. So here it's not going to respect this fancy shape that we've masked it out with. It will still retain the square corners, and the background image will not be clicked as you might expect. A hidden gotcha for UI more generally is that using a non-standard scale can sometimes cause problems. Usually it's perfectly fine, but it's often safer just to use a scale of 1 than to size the width and height. When you're new and you're just trying to make something work, it's really easy to get into one of these situations where you get one of these X's. And what that means is that the graphics are reversed and they won't be clickable. Now there is a way around it by going to the canvas and checking ignore reversed graphics here, and then it'll still be clickable, but you really shouldn't rely on that as a solution. It's way better to go and find out where you've done something horrifically wrong. So here I had the width, I had a negative width here. Likewise with the RectTransform, you need to be careful with the rotation. So if I were to give this a reversed Y rotation, then it becomes unclickable. If we zero that out, then it's clickable again. Now, Z rotation should be perfectly fine, pretty much always, unless you're doing something a bit odd. But the X rotation can cause problems, not at this angle, but when you flip it, so just like with the negative width, watch out if you're using a horizontal layout group. If it has a bad setting, the buttons can inherit that bad setting, and then they won't be interactable until you fix it. If you have a Worldspace canvas set up, you need to make sure that on your canvas you actually have the event camera assigned, or else it won't receive events. And then on the camera, you want to make sure its culling mask actually targets that canvas. And then finally, in the scene, you want to make sure that the camera can actually see the canvas objects. Alright, so if none of that worked, there's still one final thing to try, which is to examine the most likely culprit that could be remaining, and that's some image or panel or something that is sitting in front of everything and breaking your button. So to find it, you can go to Window, Search, New Window, and this will let us do a type search, so we can search for all the texts in the scene, and then we want to go and check and make sure each one has the correct Raycast target setting, and then we can do the same for the images in the scene, and here we found an image which has a Raycast target of true and is in front of everything, so it is blocking the function of our buttons. If everything is still broken at this point, you really need to reduce the complexity of your scene and your buttons, so you might consider recreating your button or recreating your canvas, and making sure that you keep the complexity low for what you're going for. Alright, so that was the 25 known reasons for how a Unity button can break. So hopefully you solved your problem and you learned a little bit about how the Unity UI system works.